Thank you for that. So from Idaho State Police, we are obviously the state agency, and our response from the Forensics Laboratory for Crime Scenes is generally from smaller agencies in the state that maybe don't have the resources to have their own crime scene response team or their own lab. Several of our larger counties and local agencies do have those resources, so we're generally responding to the smaller populations of the state. It is a request, and we respond to assist. And when I say that, I mean literally, we have a point of contact with that agency and we're there to help them. We're not there to take over their scene or tell them what to do. I am a controlled substance analyst, which seems funny that I'm a crime scene responder, but because of my start with ISP in the biology DNA unit, I did analyze items of evidence to determine if a body fluid was present or not. Semen, saliva, and blood were the biggest ones. And that's how our program initially started, was whatever you did in the laboratory would be applied into the field. So our biology experts and our latent print experts were a majority of our crime scene response. We have updated since then. We do have our own program. It is voluntary. It's based on whoever would like to be part of our crime scene response team. However, we will have a 40-hour training program, which is being developed right now by our technical leader, and we are seeking accreditation in our next accreditation cycle. Uh-oh. All right. Cruising. All right. So the first thing that I encourage everyone to consider in regards to crime scene response is that at the end goal of all of this is to present the evidence in court. So for the prosecutors and judges, this is where I'm starting here, because honestly, I think when we respond, it's in that moment, and there's so much going on at a crime scene that rarely do you actually think, oh, gee, one day I'm going to have to sit on the stand and testify to all this. And you never know when your case or you are going to be in the national news. So when you sit on that stand, is everything going to stand up to the scrutiny of court? So you have a crime scene, now what? And to be transparent, there are no crime scene photos in this presentation. So if you were worried about after lunch having to look at something, there is nothing in here. If you were hoping for that, I apologize. So the first responding officer really sets the stage for a successful crime scene. It's generally trying to bring control to a situation that's generally super chaotic. So there are a few things, basic things to consider. Is the scene secure? Number one, are you secure as that first responding officer? That is your number one priority. Then, does anyone need a life-saving support? If the person apparently is still alive, you might want to assist them. And then proceed to secure the scene and everything within it. At this point, you should document as the first responding officer who has been in that scene. Did EMS come? Did they not come? Did they actually provide assistance to the deceased person? Has the family been in? Have friends been in? I recently responded to a scene where family members and friends had already been inside and were having a bereavement party outside. So these are the things that you have to consider mitigating when you are out on the scene. So throughout the entirety of this presentation, it's basically breaking down the scene processing methodology. And it kind of looks like it's a sequence, but you will find that many of these things occur simultaneously. And when you're in the scene, you may find that you're reapplying parts of the methodology as you move through the scene and things become more complex or new things are brought to light. And some of this might also occur when interviews are going on. The main point of scene methodology to consider is that you always want to move from the least intrusive thing to the most intrusive thing. Because once you've entered that crime scene and you start moving things around, the scene will never be the way it was when it first occurred. So moving into the first area of the methodology is the assessment. So looking at the scene complexity, are there multiple scenes or locations? Are there multiple rooms in a house that are clearly involved in the scene? Are there multiple areas outside that are also associated with an area inside? Are there potential hazards, which these could be biohazards, structural hazards if there was a fire or some other damage to the building? There could be drugs. Is there fentanyl present? That's a new thing we all need to consider. Are there animals that need to be isolated or removed from the scene? Are there other risks at this scene? Is the scene location a risk in itself? Is there something on a cliff? Is there something with a hole in the floor? Is the media on scene? Just from personal experience, that greatly alters how you look at a scene and what happens during that scene. Is there upset family on scene that you need to mitigate? Moving into the actual resources needed, what physical things do you need and what personnel need to be at that crime scene? The physical things needed, do you need a lighting source? Do you need specific PPE or personal protective equipment? Do you need something special like a backhoe? Is the body buried? Do you need an anthropological team to help with that buried body? Do you need other crime scene specialists to be on that team to assist you in this investigation? The more planned you can be in this initial step, the better your scene will go. And the more methodical you can be in what you're conducting, the easier it will be to collect and preserve your evidence. Moving into the observe portion of the methodology, this might be the most important aspect of crime scene. You really need to sit and take in the scene. The best way I've had this explained to me was from Pat Zerpoli, who is a retired Pennsylvania state trooper, and he provides training through the Sherry Black Foundation. I really encourage you to look him up. It's great training. But basically it boils down to bring a stool to the scene, maybe not literally, but figuratively, and sit in it and really observe everything that's going on in that scene. Because again, once you start moving things, it will never go back to this point. Is there something that you are hearing or smelling that can't be documented by a photo? If not, then you need to write that down. And look around the scene. What makes sense? What should be there that's maybe missing? And what's missing that, or what has been added that shouldn't be there? And make sure you look everywhere. Again, this should be after photos have been done, but look under things, lift up rugs, do anything that you need to so that you ensure that every space has been searched. So looking into what is evidence? This evidence linkage triangle is the best example of what evidence is. It's basically how can you link the suspect to the victim and either of them to the scene? So consider while you're observing everything in the scene, is this important or is this maybe not important? Unfortunately, at a scene, you don't necessarily know what is or is not important. But if you think it could have a relationship linkage, then it is important. So moving into basic types of evidence, which I realize now my digital and electronics is very limited that I have listed up here. My mind was blown this morning. But biological evidence, blood, semen, and saliva are your top three. Firearms, are there handguns, ammunition, cases, bullets? Impression evidence, latent prints, footwear, attire, other weapons, sharp and blunt force instruments. Are there drugs? There could be paraphernalia, there could be powders, there could be pills. Digital and electronics are far more than cell phone and computers, but we all know that now. Fire debris, is there accelerants? Is there burned evidence you need to collect? Are there bomb components? Unfortunately too, for fire and clandestine laboratories, a lot of those chemicals kind of overlap. So maybe bring in an expert in one or both of those fields to say, is this a bomb lab or is this a clan lab? Question documents, notes and ledgers. Toxicology, blood and urine, that will typically be from the decedent or maybe a suspect, not actually in the scene itself. And then trace analysis, hair fibers and paint chips. A great quote that I found from the Ross Gardner book is that investigators do not need to be experts in every forensic science, but they must understand the nature of the different types of evidence they may encounter on a scene and how that evidence must be collected and preserved. You can't be an expert in anything, but you should know enough to be just dangerous with it. So you should know enough at that scene of what you actually need to collect and how it needs to be packaged. This is a very brief explanation of where DNA is found. So the top slide is a blood spatter, and in that you find white blood cells. The next slide is a pair of panties where it has epithelial cells and spermatozoa. And then the last slide is a hair which has tissue cells. So all of these cells have in common that they have a nucleus, and that's where the DNA is actually stored. So that's where your DNA is coming from. Each of these items can vary in how much DNA is present just based on the staining itself. And credit Matthew Gamet for the photos on the last slide and this photo. They were from one of his presentations. But the most non-intrusive way to observe body fluids is by using an alternate light source or an ALS. Some of you may have seen these. They can be a box with like a hose stuck to it. These lovely flashlights are a thing that we have in our lab, and they're great. They're made by Rofin. They're called polylight flares, and each one of them is a different wavelength. So you can actually use this out of the kit, put on your goggles, and see fluorescence. Typically, these stains, urine, semen, saliva, do actually fluoresce, but a lot of other things fluoresce too. So it's maybe just a good indication of a potential area to investigate further or to collect that item and submit it to your lab. The one thing you can never do is go back to a scene. So collect it and let the experts decide what actually needs to be looked at. So now moving, we've done our observation and now we're doing documentation. A lot of times these are simultaneous. The best thing I've ever learned is that if it's not documented, it never happened. So document it however you can, either with words on paper or through photography. It's the most important part of the scene because you're recording things at the time of occurrence. You're recording them as you're walking through that scene. The notes should always complement your photos. We do retain our photos indefinitely. However, they're digital. So if something digitally corrupted them, would our notes stand alone? That's what we consider when we're doing notes and photography. Sketches are not always needed, but we have found, or I have found personally, that they make it a lot easier to describe a room than actually writing that out. The bed was on the west wall, and west of the bed was a nightstand, and south of the bed was this. It gets very cumbersome. So doing a quick sketch is an actual easy way to document that without writing it all down. The sketch that is up here is an exploded sketch or a cross projection sketch because it's the bird's eye view with the walls folded down. Typically, I do a bird's eye view. It's pretty easy. You can also do an elevation sketch of just the wall itself. The purpose of photography for documentation is to show the location, condition, and layout as the scene, as well as items in relation to each other. There are 4 types of photos that we typically take that are recommended. An overall photo of probably this entire room, a relational photo of maybe me to that water bottle, if the water bottle is the item of evidence, a close-up of the water bottle so you can really see what it is, and then if needed, a comparison quality photo, which is typically done with a macro lens. Now, all of these should have, let me step back. You want to do everything without markers first, and then retake your photos with markers in them. The comparison quality photos, I really recommend having a subject matter expert present, especially if it's a latent print, because they literally work in that every single day. So when they need a one-to-one photo of a latent, I guarantee you they will capture that image. The other photo I have up here is just a general depiction of how you can photograph a room. So you can stand in each corner or you can stand in the middle to photograph that room. Further documentation to consider, you might need to actually measure in your items of evidence into a room. So these are a few examples, all from Gardner, of how to do that. The first example is rectangular coordinates. So they've picked areas on the west and south wall to measure to the center mass of the gun and the pants, excuse me. The second picture is triangulation. So they've used a reference point and either the corner of the room or the door to measure into the scene. If you notice on the gun, they've actually chosen 2 points to use to place that into the scene. The third photo is baseline coordinates, which I enjoy using. You run one baseline, you can measure from 0 out to wherever you're at, and then at 90 degrees go up from that. So it gives you an easy way to document where that item is in the scene. So while you're observing and documenting, likely you will do those first and then move into truly searching for items, but you're probably also searching while you're documenting. And if you are, just make sure that you mark things as you see them after overall photos are done. Believe it or not, you might forget where that case was that you needed for this projectile you found over there. So it is an easy way to search while you're documenting, but make sure that it's methodical and systematic. You don't want 5 people in 5 different rooms of a house coming to you saying, oh, I have all this stuff. It needs to be an actual planned out consideration of how you're going to search. And this is the point of the crime scene where it might become more intrusive because you might start moving items of evidence. Again, ensure they are documented. So to go into some considerations, you might need to consider the nature of the ground. Are you outside or are you in a hoarder house? There are some things that can limit your searching or affect your searching. What's the size of the item that you're looking for? Are you looking for a projectile in a field of corn? Are you looking for a gun in a tiny car? Are there environmental conditions that might influence what you're searching for first? Is it raining? Is it snowing? Are you inside and something is happening in there? And what is the size of the item being searched for? So typical searches, you can do a circle or spiral, either starting in the center, moving out, or starting out and moving in. A line search where you would just start on one side. When you see people with their hands linked together and they move forward through a field, that's a strip search or a line search, excuse me. A strip search would be where you would turn around at the end. And then there's also a grid search where you do essentially a strip search, but it's north and south and east and west. And then the last is a zone search where you just divide into zones. And you might, in a zone search, actually employ one of the other forms of searching in those zones. So moving into the collection phase. With collection, the scene is forever altered. So if you have not documented something and you now move it, I would document that you moved it without it being photographed. It sucks to be like, yes, I did do that. However, if you don't, you'll never know what actually occurred at that time. And it can be less intrusive, just picking something up out of the scene, or more intrusive, including removing drywall, removing a window, removing a door. Some of those things you might have to get special permission for. Again, it depends on what's in your warrant. Packaging, the point of packaging is to prevent loss or deterioration of the item and cross-contamination. This is a really big deal. So you want to make sure that your packaging is appropriate and it's sealed. And consider the state of the item. Is it wet? If so, it should be dried. And always, 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 I cannot emphasize enough, sign your chain of custody. It is huge for admissibility into court. So if the item is small, collect the whole thing. For example, this handgun. If the item can be sampled, such as a stain of some kind, then sample it. Make sure that those swabs are dried, but sample the item or the stain. And then if the item is large, you might have to collect the whole thing, say a door, and packaging might become a little creative, but there are ways to get that done. You might just have to really think outside of the box, but make sure that it's in a sealed condition so it's not slipping around or escaping from the actual packaging. The best rule of thumb is to package items of evidence in paper just because it's breathable. So if it is still a little wet, it can dry. The example I have next to the firearm is 2 swabs in a plastic bag, which is not great. If those swabs mold or something happens to them in the plastic, it can ruin potential for DNA analysis. Also consider, this is actually one of my cases, the sandwich bag with a lot of evidence tape on it. You don't have to encase an item of evidence in tape seal to ensure that it's secured. It needs to be secured, but someone has to open it and repackage it. So keep that in the back of your mind as you seal items of evidence. And then already be thinking about what type of analysis you actually want to happen on these items when they reach the lab, because that will help you package it appropriately. If you look at the handgun, you may want to zip tie it in areas that are textured if you want latent prints on that item. So you do need to be considering what the end goal of these items are so that you can ensure that the lab has the best opportunity to perform their job. Special items to consider are GSR kits, reference oral swabs or buccal buccal swabs, however you want to say that, major case prints. And I recommend a latent print analyst to come and collect your major case prints because they will get every surface of the palm and they can use that for their analysis in the laboratory. And then other items that might be important, but maybe you don't need to collect, you can always take a photo, but make sure that photo is in focus. This would include indicia, licenses, or any other paperwork in the scene that maybe you don't need to collect, but you do need some type of documentation. For packaging, these are just some examples of external packages that could be employed. Paper bags, evidence envelopes, paint cans for fire cases, glass containers also for accelerants in fire cases, and then internal packaging to include Faraday bags, which I highly recommend you have with all the digital evidence we learned about this morning. And for trace evidence, you can always use a sticky note, but never use actual packing tape. It has a tendency to ruin the potential to get either the tissue or what's needed off of that trace evidence. Moving into the processing and analyzing phase, this is the most intrusive step, so it's kind of the last portion of this methodology, and it can include powder processing, superglue fuming, and dye stains. I really recommend that if you are at this point of your case, you use subject matter experts. They'll know what those dye stains are reacting with, they'll know what to powder or superglue, and give you the best results moving forward. And dye stains should only be used if there's no visible blood. If you have a visible pool of blood or visible spatter, you don't need to use a dye stain. You can see it with your unaided eye. However, if you think there's been cleanup or perhaps a shoe impression pattern, you might want to consider using it at that point. These are presumptive tests that I did in the lab. I don't know if you can see them. I hope you can. It's phenolphthalein on the left and orthotolidine on the right. I prefer orthotolidine because I was trained as a biologist and that's what we used, but it turns a beautiful teal color. So there's no question as to whether or not I have a presumptive positive, whereas phenolphthalein turns pink. So if you're rubbing something pink, you might not be able to tell. If that's the case though, collect the item anyways, the lab will know what to do with it. And these are just a presumptive indication, but they can help you limit what you're collecting at the scene. And they are not as intrusive as the dye stain because you're actually removing part of the stain for the analysis. So you're not putting anything on the stain itself. So luminol and blue star, they are used as a last resort, just like any other dye stain. And the advantages are that they can show stains or impressions that are not visible to the unaided eye. They can show cleanup. And they fluoresce without an alternate light source. So that is a bonus to them. Disadvantages, you do need complete darkness to see the fluorescent. The fluorescence is short-lived. However, you can reapply the luminol or blue star, but you're now further diluting your stain. So just consider that you're now applying something to a stain. So you're contaminating it and you're diluting it, which might limit your ability for DNA analysis. Some labs may not conduct DNA analysis because it has been contaminated. And it also may interfere with the presumptive blood tests I showed on the last slide. So you might get false negatives at that point. So please, please, if you're at this point, call a subject matter expert. Bodies, first of all, they're property of the coroner or the medical examiner. Do not touch them. I have learned this. Don't move them, just photograph them until they come. Anything you do, either with their consent or with them next to you. Lately, I've had to do a lot of GSR kits on decedents, and I ask them to break rigor because I don't want to do that anyways, but I want them to touch the body so that I'm not interfering with that. But there's usually no rush to move the body. Unfortunately, they're usually waiting on us and we usually take forever. So we make sure our documentation is all complete before we call them in to move the body. But consider when you're observing the body, what is the position of the body? I actually write it down, arm bent at the elbow, hand resting on right thigh or whatever, the exact position. I not only write verbally, but we also take photos of this. Are there injuries? Where are these injuries? What do they look like? Is there red staining? Is that possibly blood? Write all that down and document it. Also, is there fragile evidence to consider? Generally, the hands will be bagged by the coroner. However, discuss with your coroner or your medical examiner. Have that open conversation of, hey, I'm concerned about this. Can we collect it now or will you collect it at autopsy? The better that relationship and communication is, the more successful you'll be. And document the body in as much detail as you've documented the entire scene. Post-mortem indicators, I'm sure you've heard of these: liver, rigor, and algor mortis, easy for me to say. Liver mortis is the staining from the blood pooling due to gravity. Rigor is the fixation of the muscles. And then algor is the temperature of the liver, which you probably will not be doing at a crime scene. But liver and rigor are indications that perhaps the body's been moved. So that's a consideration. Is the scene staged? Has something moved prior to any of us being in here? So it's just an indicator to maybe change your focus for the scene. Briefly, cause versus manner of death. Manner of death is the medical examiner or forensic pathologist's decision: homicide, suicide, accidental, natural, unknown. And then the cause of death is asphyxia, sharp force trauma, blunt force trauma, gunshot trauma. So a cause of death could be many manners of death. And then to circle back to our beginning methodology, as you can see, a lot of these happen simultaneously. It's not just a sequence of events like I'm in this assess stage, now I'm in the observation stage. It all kind of goes together and generally proceeds with the crime scene. So you might revisit a lot of this when you move to new areas of the crime scene. But remember to go from least intrusive to then most intrusive. So clearing the scene, just some considerations when you're clearing the scene. Are all items signed and sealed with the chain of custody filled out? Are photographs being turned over? If I'm responding to your scene, do you want my photos? I assume yes. So make sure that you have all the photos from all those that are responding, or you have a plan to get them. Is there a property log or an evidence log that needs left at the scene with a copy of the warrant? Make sure that gets done so you're not returning the next day or when the warrant's expired, things that could go wrong. Are there exit photos or video being taken? Who is taking them? Does the scene need relocked or retaped? And is it being released, or is someone staying for security? So it's a lot of little details that when you're done with a 12, 14, 16-hour crime scene, you don't want to think about, but you need to think about. And then this is my last little piece. I'm part of the Idaho State Police peer support team. We are revamping our team and restarting it. So I wanted to throw this in because I feel like everyone in this room, regardless of what profession you're in, you've probably worked your ass off to get there, and you've probably seen things that aren't normal. So when is the last time you actually checked in with yourself about how you're actually doing? And this short list of words, think about it. Do you feel any of these? You don't have to tell me, you don't have to tell your neighbor, but do you feel any of these? And this is pared down from 4 pages of words to describe trauma. So, or have you just reached burnout? It's important things to think about, because when you reach retirement, you should enjoy your retirement. So if you don't have peer support, find a friend to talk to, find someone to talk to. My email is at the end. You can talk to me. I don't care. I will talk to you. I think this is hugely important for all of us. So from all of that, the key takeaways: protect the scene and the evidence, document everything. Again, if you don't document it, it never happened and it was never there. Proper packaging and chain of custody are key for allowing the items to be presented in court. Your prosecutor and judges will thank you. And you should be your own priority, so take care of yourself. And just a brief thank you for inviting me here. Jenny Ayers is our technical lead for crime scene. This presentation is based off a lot of her information. Matthew Gammett, who is presenting on Friday, the laboratory director for state police. And then the reference I use the most for this is the Practical Crime Scene Processing and Investigation by Ross Gardner. If you don't have that book and you're an officer, get it. And here's some other ones. The one on the far end is the one I just talked about, and they actually have a list in the front of that book of many other books. If you can't, or your agency can't send you to training, at least get a reference, because you'll be more educated than you are currently. And then I did make a handout. I don't know if you guys got those, but for several other resources that are possible. IAI, TriTech Forensics is a ton of training for agencies. They'll come to your agency, Ron Smith and Associates. And then there are a ton of regional organizations for forensics, but we put on regional conferences yearly. So if you can, you should attend those. And then my contact information, if you have questions or think of things afterwards, I'm happy to answer anything or find the person that can answer it for you. And that is all I have.
Questions? Harry, I just have I have a tip that we used to routinely do when I was with the Oregon State Police. Is that when you do a crime scene, it's a homicide scene, the body's taken out, you've done all the work. We always thought it was a good idea to keep that scene sealed until after the autopsy, because many times the autopsy will reveal some things that are surprises or some things that you might have to go back to that scene again and to look at it in a different way.
Yes. So consider that when you're writing your warrant. I didn't talk a lot about that. We actually get a copy of the warrant when we go on scene, and we read it and make sure that what we're collecting, we can collect. I have seen a warrant as broad as anything that has anything to do with homicide. And then I've seen lists of other types of evidence. So if you're going the list route, just make sure you consult your subject matter experts, that their stuff that they're finding will actually be included in that.
Kerry, do you see it beneficial to have your local prosecutors, sorry,
I was like, where is it?
play the hide and seek game? Do you feel beneficial to have your prosecutors go through some sort of an expanded crime scene class to understand why we're asking for certain data sets on, say, call detail records, or certain information on why we're having to pull parts of a house apart, because that evidence is going to be more probative or better in court than just a photograph? Have you had much experience in that?
I don't personally know of any of our local prosecutors that have gone through training, but I don't think that it's bad. Because it does become more of an understanding and a relationship of like, hey, this is why we're doing this. And when they show up on scene, sometimes it's difficult. I've had a few scenes where they're like, well, did you test this? Well, did you test this? And it's like, no, because it's not probative. And it's, I don't think it would hurt. I think the more information we can share and make it more of a collaboration would be beneficial. And when I walk on scene, it might look different to me compared to the detective that's been on scene too. And this 1 hour presentation is really, there's a basic 40-hour class on crime scene processing. So this is literally skimming the surface of what you do at a crime scene.
How do you, when a prosecutor comes to the crime scene and is doing all this stuff with you all, how do you prevent her from being a witness at trial concerning what he or she saw at the crime scene, which might be in controversy during the trial?
In my experience, I typically let the detectives handle the prosecutor, mostly because I'm a forensic scientist and I don't talk to people. I work in a lab. But it's really one of those questions of, why do you need to be here? And what is the purpose of you entering this scene? So beyond that, I don't know. I'm not an expert in law by any means, but I have had them come through scenes before. Sometimes they're just outside like, hey, do you need anything? Hey, is the warrant okay? but they have come in before and asked me like, well, did you test this? And it's like, who are you? And again, this is, I think I skipped over this, but crime scene logs are also incredibly important. That first officer that establishes the perimeter of the scene needs to also start the crime scene log. And that is important because it shows who has come in and who has gone out of the crime scene itself. So when we, the scientists, are having to write that down, it's not great. An officer should always be on security and keeping track of who is in and out. And I did not testify in that case where the one prosecutor was asking me everything. So maybe he lucked out on not being a witness. Yeah. Most things that have gone wrong, I probably have a story for.
Kerry, what advice do you have for brand new detectives, people that have never really worked crime scenes, but then get the big one in their town or their location? And also maybe for prosecutors that, they've never had a big one either, getting more resources, when they should make calls, this kind of thing. Your thoughts there?
I think that's really in that assessment stage. When you get the scene of your life, or even if it's just your first scene, your first homicide, your first death investigation, I think you really need to consider, okay, where am I going with this? And what are the personnel resources I have access to? Like I said, for us, we get called out to a lot of smaller agencies and towns, but we can go anywhere and we will go anywhere. This is literally my job as a forensic scientist. I'm a trained observer is what I like to tell people, but we are available and we are a resource. So I would encourage any detective, regardless if they're new or if they've been a detective for 20 years, to really consider what resources they need and bring them in without hesitation. Because once you have that from the initial start of that scene, then when it does go to court, and if it does become national media, you have everyone there that you need there to support you.
So when you're at a crime scene and there may be one or two crime scene technicians there and the detective is there, do you have the detective sign off on the packaged evidence? So the testimony regarding the chain of custody at trial is maybe one person or two persons, as opposed to having two or three technicians sign the packages. So now we have a more complicated chain of custody?
It depends. We've definitely had where several of us have found and collected items. So we're going to all be called anyways. And I would assume if we're in a crime scene, we're all going to be called anyways. But we start the chain of custody. So we say that we have collected this item and I sign the chain of custody and then we give it to the detective. So typically there's only one detective, but it might be all of the crime scene responders, depending on how big the scene is. From a vehicle, maybe just one of us, but from a house, probably not.
So you alluded to challenges with coroners and medical examiners. And as a medical examiner, having worked in many coroner states, I know that sometimes there may be, I'll say, territorial differences in something that seems separate, the body and the scene, but really they blend imperceptibly. There are oftentimes pieces of evidence that could be destroyed or lost when a body's packaged and moved. So have you worked in a collaborative manner with any of those entities in terms of preserving evidence that's identified at the scene, even though it might be on the body? Versus something that's discrete at the scene, which would just be under your direct purview?
I actually have never been to an autopsy, which is unfortunate for me, I feel. But one of the last scenes I was at, I worked really well with the coroner. He's the one that broke rigor for me. And it seemed to work great. He was very perceptive. I was like, do you want to be here? I just try and go above and beyond as far as it's not a pain for me to have to work with you. And so I would rather have that collaborative, especially if something's under the body, to consider. But
if you see something right on the surface, some coroners are a little hesitant. They're like, I want to take this. You can't have it.
Yes, and we have had that before too, and it becomes more of a like, if you want to take this, then can you please package it at autopsy, or will you package it now? So that becomes one of those discussion points of, hey, I'm really interested in this one specific thing. Can I either collect it? Will you collect it for me in front of me? Or please, can you collect it at autopsy?
Right, one more question, and it's kind of multi-part.
Oh, boy.
So can you talk a little bit more about how long it would typically take you to process a house or a car?
Mhm.
And then more of the reporting aspects of it, like what do you have to do to work up your report? What do you need from other people? How long does that process take? And then third, submission to the laboratory. So what goes into making those decisions from a crime scene responders perspective, working with prosecutors and others? How do you make those decisions as far as what's going into the testing?
As far as a timetable, I have no real answer for that. Each scene is different and it depends on what you're looking for, what crime has been committed. We helped process a vehicle recently, and it was very specific what they were looking for in the passenger side of the vehicle to corroborate or show that someone was not being truthful. However, I've taken hours on a car, 6 hours on a car. It depends. Is the person a hoarder or are they clean? A lot of the houses we go into are not clean. So it depends on what we're looking for and just the nature of the scene itself. No scene is the same regardless of anything. So it can vary a few hours to many days. It's what I will give you on that. The report writing process for us, we have a LIMS system, so we can actually enter a lot of our data into that, but it is free writing. So depending on how many responders are there, usually 3 of us, been up to 5 of us. Each person one person will write the report based on our documented notes. And then each of the other responders has to verify that report. So they go through and make sure that we're following our procedure and our methodology, and then that they agree that everything has been captured that needs to be captured for the report. It will then move on to a technical reviewer, which will have to also be a crime scene responder so that they know our methodology, and they will have the final sign off on that report. So if it's a vehicle that maybe didn't have a lot going on in it, it could probably be done within a few weeks. However, if it's a large case with many scenes or a huge house, it might take months to get that process done. As far as what comes to the lab, on the scene, obviously, we kind of have a good idea of some items. Some of them will recommend that agency holds on to right away, just, hey, we're going to collect this, but maybe hold off on this specific item. But then they can call our experts at the lab and decide what might be the most probative. Generally, too, when we get back, we will have conversations with a lot of our DNA and latents analysts if they weren't present, just to be like, hey, this is what I saw, this is what they're submitting, and this is the relation to things. Or they might come in and say, hey, did you collect this? Because it's terrible. No. It's just all about communication and collaboration as far as what's being submitted to the lab. But generally, our scientists in the laboratory will probably have final say on what comes in. And again, at the crime scene, it's always better to collect it and never need it than to not collect it and need it desperately. I am here until tomorrow too. So if anything comes up and you want to talk, or you just want to talk, find me or email me.